top than I do. And he's a pretty young guy. He's a third-year DPhil student at Oxford, and clearly he didn't see the talk I gave for Paul Lucy at LPSC a few years ago, or he might not have asked me to give this, but this is a really exciting experiment that we're building at Oxford, and the work is in support of a number of different causes, different programs, but I guess relevant to this meeting is vortices. And one of the tasks for vortices is to improve the physics of the Sherman asteroidal thermal model, and this work would feed directly into that. So here's the presentation overview. Talk about the science motivation, then get into some of the nuts and bolts about what this experiment actually is, and then finish up with a list of the planned measurements. So as I mentioned, one of the things we want to do this is improve the Sherman thermal model, and the point of this model is to try to recreate surface temperatures on airless bodies, and this is a figure from Vasavada et al. 1990 something, and one of the issues that comes out of these thermal models is that they do a really good job when you're in radiative equilibrium. So when you're in a sunlit area, we can really accurately reproduce the temperatures that you would expect and temperatures that are measured by thermal instruments such as Diviner. So the plot here is showing the difference between model and observed temperatures in the lunar south polar region. And if you look at it, if you look at that in map form, it's almost impossible to tell these two apart. One of these is data and one of these is model. This is the data and this is the model. And for most of the areas, 90+% of it, it's statistically the same. In some areas, especially areas that have complex illumination areas like Faustini and Shoemaker, there are some slight differences. And one of the things that we think are going on here is that we're not properly taking into account the surface scattering effects, particularly in the thermal infrared. So these models always assume a Lambertian directional emission function, and depending on what the surface roughness is, that might not be a good assumption. So here you have a crater where you have illuminated rim, and we're trying to figure out how the visible component has been fairly well studied, but what is the thermal emission from these doing? And if it's not Lambertian, what is that function so we can include it in the model? So these are just some definitions. On the bottom left here is typical bidirectional distribution function definitions with incident illumination and the emission, and then the phase angle between the two of them. For directional emissivity, you don't have an illumination direction, so you have a emission vector, and then you have a phase angle relative to an arbitrarily defined plane. But so you can also accommodate the azimuthal information as well. So in the visible, people have been using goniometers for quite a while and doing some really excellent science. In particular, the bug experiment, the Bloomsburg University goniometer, Mike Shepard runs, and on the Diviner team, we have quite a bit of experience using this goniometer. Emily Foote has been measuring very large Apollo sample aliquots, 30 grams and greater, because as you go to more extreme angles, you need a long, thin sample. And looking at this and seeing that this is definitely not Lambertian type of scattering that you're getting off of these materials because they're complex materials. And there's other facilities, including the FIRE set up at University of Bern, FIRE 1 and FIRE 2. When you make these measurements, then you can parameterize the emission function and have a photometric model. And in most cases, people are fitting it to the Hapke model. For the thermal infrared, we don't have as good of physics for that, so we're doing a more empirical approach. So this is just a summary of what we just said. So this is a CAD drawing of the space goniometer and kind of what the current state is. It's about 1 meter across, and it's designed to fit into a vacuum chamber, a large format vacuum chamber. It has a sample changer here, and can currently accommodate 2 samples and 2 black bodies. It's designed to have these arms that move around, and I'll show a little bit more detail about that. And then inside this vacuum chamber is also a large format cold shroud, so that you can essentially simulate the space environment, and we're typically are looking at lunar and asteroidal type environments for this work. This is, I'll mention that in a minute. And one of the things about we're trying to develop with this is keeping it modular, so we can swap out whether we're looking at visible, if we're looking at mid-infrared, we can change out the filters. And we also have the capability of adding in an illumination source if we want to do a full-on illumination and emission experiment. So here's some actual pictures of this thing. It does exist. It does work. Here's the radiometer carriage, and this would be the illumination arm. And the sample for the experiments we've been working on so far are being heated from below only. We haven't added in the illumination source for doing the heating from above as well. So this really is directional emissivity. Here's some additional detail about it. The radiometer is a small radiometer. It's using filters that are not coincidentally very similar to those that are used on Diviner. And because we would like to use that for validation. It has also has capabilities of doing visible, so we can understand the properties of the instrument itself, and then thermal infrared for the measurements of interest. There's an optical design. This is a picture of the vacuum chamber with it open, and you can see the space goniometer inside there. And then this is when the cold shroud has been lowered, but the vacuum chamber is still open. This is the sample chamber, 2 black bodies. If you look at the screens, you can see the texture that's on these black bodies to try to capture the concavity effects for the black bodies, and then 2 samples. And this is a FLIR camera image of it during an experiment where we were heating, and so the samples are warmer than the background. So currently we have validation work ongoing. One of the first things we want to try to do is reproduce what the visible bidirectional distribution function experiments are doing. So this plot on the upper right is showing the reflectance factor as a function of emission angle. The blue line is data published by FIRE, and then the green line is data from this experiment. And we have some generally pretty good agreement. If you add in the extra dimensional axis, you can start producing these types of contour plots as well. And that's pretty much the build to date. It's quite an impressive experiment, and almost all the work has been done by Tris himself, including the motor controls, the heater controls, building the radiometer, sample changer. And it's a very nice DPhil experiment. So the next steps are to start moving this into the thermal infrared, heat, and doing a lot of the types of experiments that we're doing in another experiment at Oxford, the simulated lunar environment chamber. That's a different experiment because although we are creating a similar environment, that's hooked up to an FTIR, so you get a full high-resolution spectrum. In this case, because we need the ability to move around, we can't get the full spectrum, but we are getting discrete filter channels. So start doing a lot of science experiments, including heating samples with different grain sizes, and see how that affects the directional emissivity pattern, and also to look at different surface roughness effects. This is kind of in line with the work that Carrie Donaldson-Hanna has been doing, and we have a poster showing some of the select results from that. And then test a bunch of different samples that have different optical properties, from nearly transparent pure minerals and salts like quartz and KBr to really dark stuff like Apollo soils and meteorite samples. And we have all these materials in hand and ready to use. And of course, the ultimate goal is to make measurements of actual lunar regolith samples, and then calculate the directional emissivity functions and feed that back into the 3D thermophysical models. So I think that is all we have. We do have a movie that shows this going. If you can start up the movie. And so this is the chamber going around in a scan pattern. So it's going around the outside, and then the carriage is in this line in the middle, and that steps up as it goes through. So I'd be happy to take any questions, or you can contact Tris with questions as well. Thank you.
I assume that movie was sped up.
Yeah, it's sped up. It's a combination of they have a webcam basically that's just over the top of it, and they take frames.
Questions for Ben? Well, I have one. I'm curious about the textures that you're looking at. I saw the poster, although I didn't get to talk to anyone about it. I've seen a lot where, people pour the samples in and, or scrape them off. And I was wondering if you thought about sifting them at all, because I think that's how, when Happy was originally talking about this fairy castle structure and the strange texture and backscattering properties of the regolith, they found they could recreate that with a sifting through a fairly fine sieve.
Yeah, so they are working on different textures. Sifting, I don't think, is one that they're currently working on. One of the other DPhil students there, Charlotte, is working on kind of the air blast method, where you have a tube and you put a puff of air in and the sample goes up, and then you try to get that scaled right so that you can reproduce the fairy castle structure.
Okay.
So that's another one of the textures we try to evaluate.
Yeah, that'd be great, since that seems to be kind of limitation between the lab and the, surface.
Yeah, but if you look at Carrie's poster, there's not huge differences, even though there's some pretty big differences in sample preparation techniques.
Yeah, okay, great.